Good evening, everyone. I'm Amanda Packel, here to welcome you on behalf of the Stanford Rock Center for Corporate Governance. I just quickly wanted to mention a couple programs that we have upcoming. One is in a couple weeks on February 9th. In the evening, we have our Morrison and Forrester Lecture in honor of Marshall Small, which this year features Niall Ferguson, who is now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he'll be lecturing on risk management in finance and geopolitics, a tale of two silos. It should be a very interesting discussion for those of you who are familiar with Niall Ferguson's books. Also, since it's particularly relevant to tonight's topic of the battle for boardroom talent, I just wanted to mention our Directors College program, which we hold annually at the end of June. This year's program is June 25th to 27th, and we're still in the early tuition registration period for about another month. So for any of you who are interested, feel free to ask me or Dan after the program or find information on our website. And with that, I'll turn it over to this evening's moderator, Professor Dan Siciliano, who's also the faculty director at the Rock Center. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Amanda. Thanks very much for joining us. At least it wasn't pouring as hard as last night or the night before. I was worried about continued weather impeding our attendance. I'm super excited to moderate this session this evening. It is, as you hopefully read, thematically a little bit different from most workshops or sessions on the topic of boardroom refreshment or boardroom talent or boardroom diversity, in that we're really going to try to be pretty tactical. We are going to assume that it's the smart thing to seek a more diverse, a more refreshed, a more enlightened, and a more active board of directors for publicly traded as well as private companies. So with that assumption in place, we're going to talk about what do you do once you're trying to do that, because I think that actually gets a little bit less treatment than it deserves. And I'm very excited to have kind of three experts from different worlds that all intersect into the same place here to join us and to discuss those items. We will leave about 15 or 12 minutes at the end to do some Q&A. We've basically come up with questions and picked the best that we thought would help elucidate some of the more interesting topics. So let me just introduce folks very briefly. I encourage you on the email that you got to kind of click through and get their full bios. I can't do them justice in a short amount of time. But we have with us Lee Hansen, who's vice chairman of Heidrick & Struggles. Let's just say in short that Lee is the person who places people into companies in the form of boards and executives in a way that when you need someone to come and speak at your director's college, you call her or her colleague up and say, can you get access to, and pretty much whoever you say next, she says, sure, just spoke to them last Tuesday. Oh, I got them their first job. Oh, yeah, I just got them onto such and such a board. So she's kind of at the center of it all, and more importantly, is very much a trusted counsel to boards looking to try to get stuff done in this space and in others. So we're super happy to have her. Glad she came and joined us today to spend some time. I'm also really happy to finally have someone who we've been in the orbit of and talked to and has been at our sessions, but I've never had a chance to have on one of my panels, Amal Johnson. She's the recently immediate past executive chairman, but now also still a board member of Author IT Inc. She has very broad experience in the tech industry in Silicon Valley, everything from cloud computing to hosted services to enterprise. If you've been in this space for very long, you've run across her. She is a sitting board member on three, I guess, really, boards, and has played critical roles. And these are high growth, small cap to mid cap. So great diversity of experience, and has actually been in the place where it's Silicon Valley. There's always a talent crunch, so you've managed to get great directors to help propel your boards to success. So we'll get a lot. I joked beforehand, we'll be doing the Amal refrain, where I'll say, so Amal, last year, how did that actually work for you, kind of thing. So we'll do that a lot, and we're really happy to have her. And then finally, super excited to do another session with Paula Loop. We've now been on both coasts, which is kind of fun the last few months. Paula is the leader of the Government Insights Group with PwC, which is kind of this vague cover-up for the fact that she's a talented, essentially executive strategist for boards and companies on issues ranging from the kind of minutia of how boards work and how companies can get stuff done, all the way to board placement, and now increasingly best practices in corporate governance. And we all know that you need a professional to sort out the best practices in corporate governance, particularly for any given company, because one size doesn't fit all. So we're super happy to have Paula here. We keep drawing her into programs all over the country, so thank you for being willing to come out and spend time with us. So with that, let me just jumpstart with a big picture question, and it's assuming you want to cast a wider net, looking for new directors, what steps do you actually take? Like, who do you engage, who do you talk to, and what do you do that's different from past practices when you say, and this time we're recruiting an even broader set of folks, whether it's age, gender, ethnicity, whatever it might be, this casting of a wider net. Maybe we start with Lee.
Yeah. Sure. Well, I first thought I would start with the circumstances under which we're called upon to cast a wider net, because we're increasingly, compared to, say, 10 years ago, where they'd say we're just looking for one director and this is what this person looks like, it's a financial expert, it's this, it's that. Increasingly we are getting involved with companies over a longer period of time, where they're going to have a series of needs on the board, and that could come through, it's activists, it's the M&A activity. There's a lot of different things that will cause a company to need a number of directors over a period of time. So we still get the one-offs of we'd really like to have a sitting CEO. Some of the same needs the boards have expressed for a long time, we're still hearing: sitting CEO, a CFO. But increasingly we are looking for different kind of skill sets, where they may not have the same knowledge base as a board than they had in the past. So whether it's somebody was asking earlier today about digital, I mean, that's it's been a hot topic for the last year or two. And so where do you, when you look to cast a wider net, where do you look? And it really depends on where the company is headed and what their skill sets that they might need are. But it's looking at people that you haven't historically looked before, and we're going to get to this later, but they may not have served on boards before. So it's, it is really casting a wider net, talking to a lot more people, and looking for the kinds of strategic and business skills that they may need that are different than the past.
Great. Amal, you want to jump in? I'm going to have each of you do this one, if you don't mind, if that's okay.
Well, as Lee said, it depends what you're looking for. And the traditional way is to say, I want a sitting CEO who has experience in Taiwan, understands semiconductor, and has at least one public board experience. The minute you put these very fixed requirements down, you shrink your pool that's available for you to go after. I think a better way to look at it is to say, let's just loosely define what we're looking for, and then see what's the talent that's out there. Talk to as many as we can, without even a promise of a board seat, but just get to know some of the candidates, especially if you have time to prepare. And many of the good boards do that. They always have a pipeline of directors they would love to have when the openings happen. If you do that, then it's much easier when the time comes to say, I talked to John, and he just has everything we're looking for. Let's pull him in. Or I talked to Mary, and let's pull her in. So it's not just the moment you have that need. It's the process you follow as part of governance, like you do a CEO succession planning. Why don't you do board succession planning? So that you always have a pipeline of different talent based on where the company is going and the strategy, and that gives you the time and the ability to look at as wide group of selections as you can have.
So Paula, and feel free to throw in the meta-analysis in addition to your answer.
No, I think I would step back just a bit. Totally agree with what everybody said. I think that at this point, the Nom/Gov committee chair, who usually is responsible for succession planning for the board, is going to be in the hot seat over the next couple of years. It was after Sarbanes-Oxley, it was the audit committee chair, then it was the comp committee chair when We got through Say on Pay. Now it seems like it's really going to be the NomGov committee chair. And
Everybody gets their turn. It's great.
everybody gets their turn. And the good news to that is that I think that succession planning at the board level is going to be more thoughtful, because I think there's going to be more accountability. Investors are definitely looking into this. They want to see what the decisions that are being made, why they're being made, and so forth. So people are going to be more thoughtful about it. We do an annual corporate director survey at PwC. We get like about 900 corporate directors to respond. I think it's one of the largest surveys. And we have two specific questions that I thought I would just share with the results, because I think it's inspiring and it's interesting. So one question we asked was, did you make any changes to your board? We asked these 900 directors, did you make any changes to your board either because of or anticipation of investor influence? So we heard back from them that 61% of them said they put somebody new on their board because they were looking for a skill set. Probably gets back to what you were talking about. 46% said that they were looking for diversity, so they added somebody for that reason. 35% said they were looking for somebody younger. They added somebody from an age perspective because they were looking for somebody younger. 24% said they removed somebody due to age. 15% said they removed somebody due to tenure, so there you go, we're getting some refreshment. And 17% of them said they added an activist, maybe because they had to or maybe because they wanted to, but we'll leave that at that. So the other question that we asked was, when you're going out and you're searching for these new directors, where do you search? What are your sources that you're looking for? And almost 90% of the directors said we look at our own networks. That's one of the places we start. We've heard that for years, but it's actually creeping down a little bit. The other thing, about 60% said they use a search firm. Again, creeping down a little bit. Sorry, Lee, I'm sure you're still getting all the really good ones, though, at the end. Still around 50% said they use management recommendations, so the company CEO, executives, and so forth. 18% said they get suggestions from investors. That was new and different. Over the last couple of years, that number has really gone up. And then the other one that's really gone up is 11% said they're using public databases. And for the most part, public databases that people use are there because they actually can really identify diverse candidates. And so I know that CalSTRS had one, which I think they just gave to Equilar. NACD has a public database. So there's public databases that will sort by diversity and so forth. So the good news for me from that is that it seems more thoughtful, seems that people are using different sources. There's different opportunities there for people, I would think, to find good talent.
So I want to drill down on something you highlighted, which is this common behavior and a perfectly proper behavior in many ways of tapping directors' own networks as a starting point for the discussion. And yet it's interesting, if you look at, and there's lots of these studies now which are in part enabled by Facebook and LinkedIn and other things, people's social connectedness is much more limited than you anticipate, though I will note one small asterisk for law professors, which I'll highlight in a second, which is if you look at the plus or minus 5 years of your age, and technically it's your high school and your college graduation cohort, but let's call it age, out of the 5 plus and minus years, your connectedness really drops if you look at these graphs. It's kind of stunning. It like drops to almost zero for non-family members, for non-friend of friends. And it makes perfect sense, right? Because you're in touch with your classmates, the people you grew up with in whatever organization you started in. And so my question, and the asterisk for law professors is that we're always glomming on to our latest, brightest graduates. So our spread for age is really good. That's the way we try to keep young. What do you think is the way to help board members and boards still tap this idea of network, which is important, and we'll dig into that a little bit more, but not get caught up in this limitation, right? So if you limit it to that, or the normal way of approaching that, you kind of cast a pretty narrow net by definition. So either from professional experience in running searches or maybe direct experience in searches, what do you do to say, great, let's go with that because that feels good and is useful in some ways, but let's tweak it or change it so that we get more out of this network strategy?
Start with that, because I got firm views on that.
Great.
So even when we are retained, they've retained a search firm, they want to look broadly, I would say I can't think of a search we've done where the board hasn't volunteered some candidates.
Sure.
And sometimes they're extremely good candidates. I think what happens out of that often is we go into a search. We've just talked about broadening the net, but companies and boards have a firm view as to what they are really looking for. And they've done a lot, people are much more focused on it now than they used to be in terms of where's the company going in strategy and skill set gaps and all those things and what they're going to be losing. So it's a thoughtful exercise. And then we all agree, here is broadly what we're looking for. And then somebody will say, oh, but Susie, she's great and she doesn't fit any of what we've talked about in terms of priorities. Mm-hmm. But she's great, I know her, she'll fit in. So there really still is a bias in many cases to go with whom you know. So that's where I think it can get a little off kilter. The person may end up being an excellent board member, but it does sort of undercut what the process they've gone through up to that point in terms of developing their skills and needs. So I don't know if you've had any similar experience.
The the reason for that, as you well know, Lee, requirements, you're not hiring a VP of sales. You're not hiring a VP of marketing. You're bringing on board a director. And the fit and the chemistry is so crucial because many of us sat on dysfunctional boards, and there is nothing more disruptive to a company than a dysfunctional board. Right. So you may have the perfect candidate with all the right qualification, but if the fit is wrong or they come in with their own agenda versus the company's agenda, it could be very disruptive. And trying to ask somebody to leave the board after 1 or 2 years is a bad reflection on the individual and the company. So that's why when I'm in dialogue with future directors, I say to them, it's as much your responsibility to assess whether you're a good fit as it is ours. Because if it doesn't work out, it's painful for you and it's very painful for us. So let's both go at it. And I have turned down opportunities where, I talked to the chairman, I talked to the CEO, I'm meeting with the board, and the last minute, I said, you know what, this is not for me. And I walked away from it.
Now, Amal, I think I want to dig deeper into this whole diligence socializing thing, because if you cast the wider net and you don't have this easy 1 degree of separation, I think you do have to do things to get the board comfortable. But before we move that, I want to ask you a follow-up question, because you mentioned something earlier. When your nom-gov committee says we're looking for either some succession planning for the board and or we're looking for someone, do people have nominations? You did something interesting when you told people to think about and make nominations. Could you describe how you kind of ask them to go beyond the normal, here's someone who I'm thinking about a little bit?
Well, it's, we all think about what do we have today that we're looking for. But when you're doing succession planning, you really are looking out 3 years, 5 years for where the company is going. So I think that's what you're referring to. Yeah. You ask them to, look, yes, I know these are the 5 names that you have given us, but can you really think beyond that? Can I ask you to think about 3 years from now, what do we need? Can you think about, do you know of somebody who's young, who we could take a risk on, but brings so much talent to the board? And in one case, I took a risk on one director. She was terrific, and she is terrific. She's now on our board. She worked at IBM. She worked at Intel. She had very strong semiconductor background. She was she was CEO of an Israeli company, but she has never had public board experience. And I said, I was then the chair of Gov, and I said, I think we should take a risk on this one. She's terrific. It'll work out. We did. But by doing so, I also volunteered that I will also mentor her for the whole first year, which means I worked closely with her. I answered questions that she may have had. And now she's a colleague. She is the chair of Gov now, and I'm the chair of Comp. So we work very closely together still.
So before I jump to the follow-up question, which is, okay, how did you get the rest of your board to feel okay taking that risk? I want to put a pin in that because I want to come back to that. But before we go that far down, I want to come back to this idea of very limiting prerequisites and how either on the board or Lee as an advisor, or Paula, when you're kind of outlining the new best practices, how you manage that? Because I think we brushed over at the beginning, but the preferences for prior board experience are very, very strong. And more so, the sitting CEOs are more scarce. They have less opportunities on other boards. And so having at least one, maybe two sitting CEOs on your board, I think the desire is even stronger than it has been in the past. So one, how limiting are these factors? Like, does it really reduce the pool? And how do you get past that? Because they seem, at a certain level, very reasonable because the risks you outlined. So prior board service, you can diligence it, and they either do or don't manage well in a complex boardroom, and you reduce that risk very much. And that seems really smart, right? So can you walk us through that? Because we always say, oh, just loosen your list. I say that too, but it's really hard.
What we encourage, and not every board is going to adopt this, but I mean, we encourage our boards to be as broad thinking as possible, and particularly when they're looking for specific talent, or they're looking to bring the age down on their board, or they're looking for digital experience. You know, when you're not going to find 60-year-old people with digital experience, it's going to be younger people. So part of it is our advice to our clients, you know, showing them here's what the universe looks like, here's your choices, and you may have to make some trade-offs. You may not be able to get people who've been on boards and yet have that digital experience or are going to be younger. So I think if they see some people, I mean, when we have, this may not be the first time we're working with a client, but after they work with us a while and trust our judgment, say, we know you're not going to, on paper, you're not going to say this person's going to fit, but trust us, we think this person's a good person, and you ought to at least meet him or her. And some of our best placements, our proudest placements, are when we've done that, and they've said, you're right, we didn't see it on paper, but this person, because of the intellect and the experience they bring, it could really be valuable for the board.
So real quick, sorry. One is face facts. There are trade-offs. So you kind of have a
and
reality
just
check.
show them what the market is. Right.
And the second is you kind of suggest meet them, right? So get to the point where you interact and you can maybe appreciate those differences. Paula, I know you kind of fit the best practices into this approach. Can you expand on that even more? Because I think that's a great answer, and I think it plays out well. But I don't want to underplay the true resistance. Like, you're persuasive, and if they retain you, I believe that they're going to follow your advice, right? Especially if you have a long-standing relationship.
Yep.
That helps, right?
Yep.
But a lot of time, you have sometimes a smaller board, a smaller company, and they don't have the advantage of you, perhaps. So, Paula, what do you recommend to the nom-gov, chair who's out there saying, "Okay, I hear you, but what do they do?"
So I recommend, I'm not entirely convinced everybody's jumping on the bandwagon still. So, but I definitely think the wider net is absolutely the truth, and that's the way it's got to go. But I think, one of the things that we're seeing more and more people looking at is divisional, presidents and that sort of thing at companies. So going beyond the executive team down one level below, and you can still get a fantastic reference from an executive, from the CEO about that individual and so forth. So you can still get, I think, that confidence that they'll be able to work well in a board setting from somebody that you would respect and you would. So I think you can still get that. You just are going to have to look someplace else. And boards that are really interested in doing this will do it well. Boards that are not interested in doing it will not. And I mean, I think that's unfortunately sort of the way it is. And I hate not to keep bringing up the survey, but one other question we do ask is we say, when you're looking for diverse candidates to our boards, is it challenging to do that? Women, by the way, almost 100% didn't think it was that challenging. They think that there are really good candidates out there. Men, not so much. They have a much harder time getting comfortable that there are, adequate or decent diverse candidates out there to fill the board positions. So another change that we have to continue to work at to try to convince people that those individuals are out there. But they really are.
But you make a very good point also in terms of the CEO. If we're asked to call a CEO of a company, and typically he, sometimes she says, no, I can't due to capacity. The first question is there anybody on your team that you think is ready to step up? And sometimes that's how we get to the best people. And that endorsement from the CEO makes a great difference.
Yeah. So you can get that, you can still get that reference, that confidence without having had somebody be on a board before. And that's where the new ripe talent is. You know, just moving around the current board members is not going to get you that new, diamond that's out there.
I've heard it suggested, and I've seen it work maybe a little in a mall. I'm curious if you've experienced this. So the proxy, in addition to the CEO reference and some other, encouragement for those who are one level below the C-suite, is to look at folks who have board proximity, board engagement, board exposure, right? It's not board service, but boards are increasingly, as a best practice, directly engaging with divisional presidents, heads. It's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to not just interact with one or two of management, but more. So does that work as a suggestion to give a little bit of comfort maybe to men perhaps, or to the others on the board who are resistant to this no board experience? If you say, listen, here's a close analogy. This is something we can read from. Is that actually a useful argument? Have you been able to use that at all, or did it come up?
I would say yes. I mean, I've had board members call me. I can think of one recently called and said, I realize this is not your normal board candidate, but I'm on a board, and the head of HR, I think, is amazing. I mean, she's very strategic. She's far beyond a more classic head of HR. I think you really ought to look at her. So we are absolutely going to give that person more consideration as a result of that that referral. And it's, again, being able to say, this isn't just our judgment. We've heard this validated by somebody who has seen her work firsthand with the board.
When I was CEO, and I still see it now with the companies I'm sitting on the board, I always wanted to take a couple of my direct reports who are really, I'm mentoring, I'm helping to get to the next level, and see if I can them board assignment.
Yeah.
I go out of my way looking for opportunities for them to serve on boards, because that is such a good experience for them, and it helps me as the CEO then to have somebody on my staff who appreciates what the board needs, wants, how you interact with them. So that is something also as a director you can encourage the CEO to look at their staff and say, who's ready? Who's your successor? And how do we give them the education and the training? And one of the best ways to do it is to find a board for them to sit on.
This is a little sidetrack comment, and I don't want to send us down in the wrong direction, but one of the things I think a lot of people don't think about is how long it does take to get onto a board, and the importance of doing it in many cases when you are still in a sitting executive position or so forth, and then not putting it off, but actually starting as quickly as soon as you can, as soon as you get that idea that this might be something, start that networking, because that networking process takes a lot longer than I think people realize. I'm constantly getting I'd like to go on a board, and I'm saying, okay, well, you're 62. It's too bad you didn't start 4 or 5 years ago, because you could have worked on it and gotten yourself a little bit closer by now.
Yeah, I thought you were going somewhere else with that as well, which I think is something to consider, which is when you're sourcing future board members and there's a pipeline, the process of getting onto, placing someone on a board after a time of a search can take a long time. Hopefully it doesn't take too long, but from the consideration to the end, it could be 8 months, a year, 2 years. And interestingly, in the demographic that I think we're talking about from a career trajectory viewpoint, that's a period of time where 1 or 2 years can make the difference between VP and SVP and EVP. Like, a lot happens in, whatever age group it might be, between 45 and 50, for highly talented, upward mobile executives. So you start when they're a SVP, and by the time you actually ask them to be on the board, they might be about to move on and be an EVP somewhere.
But start early.
Let's assume we've gotten into the orbit of the right people. You're talking to them, but we still have this. So back to what we put a pin in. You have this more than 1 degree of separation. The candidate everyone thinks might be great. There have been some reticence, but other people are embracing it. You just don't have a close connection to them. No one went to school with them. They aren't in the same age, generational category. There's just no common connection, or very little. It makes it hard to feel like there's a good fit. What do you actually do to try to, A, evaluate if there's a good fit and help people feel like there's a good fit? Is it lots of interviewing? You fly out? I mean, what are the things you do to make that work? Start with Lee and then just go on down the line, if that's okay.
And I would say in most cases, the board is able to diligence, maybe it's 2 degrees of separation.
Okay.
They'll talk to somebody they know, or they'll at least need some validation from some board member before they're willing to. Now, there are exceptions. So we did a search where this is a person who was well known in one community. We're putting her on a board of a very different business. So there was really no connectivity. And I think there the board was willing to take a chance. I mean, she was clearly an extremely accomplished person. Her references were amazing. Sometimes the board members want to do, and we encourage it, to do a couple of references on their own, to hear it firsthand, rather than just being relayed through us. I just think it gives them comfort if somebody is on the board and has heard those comments directly. And probably a little bit more time, maybe one-on-one with each of the board members. It may just take a little longer. In contrast, I'm putting somebody on a board, hopefully next week, where it all was very, very fast because one person on the board knew this person inside out and was able to validate them. And it was amazing to me the difference in terms of how quickly they jumped on this person because one person endorsed them heavily. But some of the best talent have been where they're not known, but they've invested the time. And to your point, the fit is the biggest thing. You can get very, very comfortable. This person has done exceptionally well in their career, but you just don't know until the person's on the board. I mean, I did a search probably 5 years ago where we put on, this person had the exact right background, had spent a lot of time. We referenced them. I get that dreaded call 6 months later. Joe wasn't working out. I said, oh my God, what's he done? And it turns out he was so smart that he just wanted to lecture the board on everything. I would say he was an academic. But,
oh, sorry. Bad name for all of us.
But, and I think that gave them, of course I took responsibility. Now, how could we have found out that he'd be like this in a boardroom because he'd never been on a board before? But, so there's always, you are going to take a little more risk. That's just it. I mean, it may, at the end of the day, hopefully it's worth it. But that's always the risk.
For a moment there when you said you took full responsibility, I thought you were going to say you're like a more full-service firm than I expected. And Joe disappeared. Needed another search. It was all okay.
I don't know where Joe
I'm just kidding. So, Amal, what things have you tactically deployed?
So I'm going to do it from the candidate's point of view.
Oh, great.
So I was a candidate for a board in the Midwest. And the company was interesting, but not in its current incarnation. But the strategy where the company was going, the innovation they were thinking about, they were looking for somebody with my background. I talked to, again, the chairman, the CEO, perfect. So I flew to Chicago to meet with the rest of the board. And we had a board dinner. It was about 8 of the 9 board members. A couple couldn't make it. And we start talking. And I asked a simple question. I said, what's your succession planning for the CEO? Simple, right? You want to know that they're doing that. And for some reason, one of the board members, the chairman, said, well, he's not going anywhere. He's lucky to have this job. When we picked him, he was on the beach. After the dinner was over, I called the search executive I was working with, and I said, this is not for me. The lack of respect at that moment, I don't think he meant it that way. I don't think it was, but the way it came out told me that that's not something that would fit my style. And I just left. I walked into that dinner expecting to accept, because everything seemed to be great, everything is fine, until I was in that room and I asked a tough question. So the board has to do the same. If you're looking at the candidate, have a dinner.
As a social connection as opposed to just an interview in a conference room, because some behaviors come out, good or bad.
Yeah.
And I think even now, only at the company level as well as at the board level, people have gotten so much better about doing sort of situational interviewing. In other words, not just an interview that says, oh, you're from New York. What do you think about the Yankees? Oh, I like the Yankees. Okay, now we're good. We're buddies. And you spent a half an hour talking about the Yankees. But more of a conversation about, give us some examples of different things you've done with boards or whatever, so much more situational, so more of a focused interview. And I'm not sure that there's that many board members that are really just blanket capable of doing that or even think that's what the role is, but you'd have to probably define it a little bit better. And back to your point about, how you look at it from your side, I hear very many board members say that it's like a marriage when you get into one of these things. You're going into it really like it's for the long haul. It's not, to your point, Lee, something you can just ditch after a year or two and it won't be a big public, announcement. So it will be. So you really have to do the diligence.
Commitment.
It is on both sides, really serious
10-year
commitment. And then at some point, Dan, I do want to talk about, well, what kinds of things can you do then to help that board member be successful? Because
Absolutely.
I think that's a critical thing.
Let's shift to that. Let me point out one thing, expanding on your interview style and technique. Tell me if this makes sense to you. I think not only is it not a good practice to have kind of this kind of shallow conversation about shared connections and shared interests, but it's also a potential real misfire that sends the wrong signal depending on the distance between age, generations, and experience. So you can imagine kind of the retired CEO baby boomer from the Midwest in an industrial company serving on the board of perhaps a tech company or otherwise, interviewing the kind of oldest edge of the millennials who's, maybe she's a young CFO of a small publicly traded company. That intersect of social conversation, not only does it not tell you much, but it's probably going to make everyone feel slightly awkward and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like, well, what did you do in LA? Well, I went to Comic-Con. What? And then, and it's just, they're going to be talking across. So to your point, I think the situational and kind of demonstrative example questions give a chance for people not just to shine, but also that's what you're going to have in common, right? So I think that's a really good point to kind of highlight. And out of curiosity, Lee, do you coach your boards or kind of highlight for them best practices for interactions, and are they all different depending on the candidate?
Yeah, it will definitely be different. I'm smiling when thinking about this is a chair of a board who will probably be retiring as soon as the board can make that happen, who asked a candidate the other day, so tell me the one thing that I'm not allowed to ask you legally.
No.
Wow.
And we're all sort of stunned, thinking, okay, now I've got to go back and talk to the candidate and explain the context. So some people just don't take coaching.
Yeah.
But more. I mean, we our
He thought
coaching
he was finessing it.
I know, exactly.
Clever way.
So, I mean, there's some obvious things like if you're interviewing 2-on-1, don't ask the same questions with each.
Right.
Focus on strategy here, or make it so it's you get the information you need, but it's also not the candidate saying the same things all over. But also giving them some, coaching the clients on what the candidate's hotspots are, what are their concerns, and here's how you should address them or not. If that's just make yourself comfortable that this is the right person.
So absent someone like you in the boardroom helping with that, it probably makes sense, and I'm sure, Molly, you've done this, to have a conversation in advance about what constitutes a productive interaction with the prospective candidate and what works and what doesn't. But we have about 5 more minutes before we want to switch over. So I think to Paula's point, let's switch gears. Let's imagine that you've cast the wide net. You brought someone to the fore. They were really different, but they turned out to be great. Everyone felt good about it, and you're onboarding them. And so first, are there best practices about onboarding that you've observed that just make for better boards? So I'm curious about that. But specifically, are there some things you think that should be attended to or done differently in light of bringing a board member on that is more different from the board as it exists? So they're either younger, they're different gender, they're different background, maybe different international. They're different. So do you actually double down on the onboarding? What do you do? Is it unique, different? Maybe start with Paula in this case. I know you.
Well, so I have a couple of different things, and I'm not sure if I can say what best practices on all this, but I have heard of different things that people do. So one, and it would be hard pressed to say, well, you're so different, we're going to onboard you differently. I would feel bad for that person.
Yeah.
So that would be a struggle for me, right? But I've heard different boards do different things. One, this concept that you talked about mentoring, so a board buddy. I think that's a really good concept, not only for a new person that's never been on a board before, but even for a board, somebody who's an experienced board member to say, here's your board buddy so that you don't disrupt every meeting that we have, asking questions about things that we've discussed the last 2 years or whatever. Here's your board buddy that you can work with to make sure that you're up to speed on everything, and maybe you can have offline conversations with to get caught up. I think that's a fabulous idea. So that, I think, works really well. The other thing I've heard is the concept of having individuals audit or sit in different of the committee meetings, not be a member of all the committee meetings, but it's sitting there to understand what's going on. And in particular, I always hear board members saying you've got to sit in on the audit committee because that's where you really understand the meat and potatoes of the finances of the business, and so how everything kind of works, and you learn a lot in that. One example I do have of a public company, a well-known public company, who has a policy of putting individuals on the audit committee as what I would consider undue punishment when you first join the board, and everyone has to do that. And it's actually a fairly small audit committee in this example. It's 3 people. So this individual I'm thinking of had a very strong marketing background. He did not have a very strong finance background. He is now on the audit committee and really struggling. And I've been trying to spend actually a lot of time tutoring him to help him get up to speed in a role that he's probably not necessarily that suited for. He probably would have been much better off auditing the audit committee versus being a full member. And I do feel for the other 2 members in the room that are obviously carrying that. So that wouldn't be my suggestion, but I do think the auditing is a good idea. And then my last comment, I think, around this is I think if you're starting to bring in board members that have not been on boards before, and hopefully we see more of that, and we see that as more diverse candidates come on, I do think the concept of board assessments or board feedback is going to be more and more important. Because individuals, every job you've ever had, you've had an assessment process, you've had feedback, and that's how you're going to get better at what you do. And if boards don't get in the practice of doing that every year, when there's an individual that potentially has some problematic style issues or whatever, if you can't get to them in a normal routine of annually giving them a little bit of feedback and hoping that they're evolving and changing and adapting, it's going to be really difficult to approach them 2 or 3 years down the road and say, oh, it's not working, when you should have really given them an opportunity to correct and get better at it before you did that.
It's so tough for boards to do for whatever reason.
It's so hard.
Yeah. Mal or Lee, any additional points on that?
A couple of things. One, the onboarding comes in 3 dimensions. First one is, how do you get them to know the company? And not just at the boardroom. They have to get to know who are the key players, what functional areas, what challenges does the VP of marketing faces, technology roadmap. And you don't do all of that in the boardroom, especially when existing board members have seen it for years. So you have to take the time to really get them to know the company at a level a bit deeper than just attending the 5-6 sessions per year. Second, you have to really give them room and time to understand the dynamics of the different committees. So one of my companies doesn't assign the initial board member to any committees for 6 months. They're welcome to attend any of them, all of them, but they don't have responsibility to be on any one specific one. And the third one is really especially if they don't have any public board experience, make sure you send them to the Directors College. Make sure you let them know. Absolutely. Make sure you let them, since you are already in that community, what other things happen that really could be beneficial to them. Like I love coming every the 3rd Thursday of the month to Kim's Silicon Valley Directors Exchange. That's a great session, 2 hours, you get great topics, you network with other directors. So, but they don't know about it, especially if they have a full-time job, right? So giving them those tips that you take for granted will also be very helpful.
And just very quickly, I was like, in terms of going to a director's college, because we've had a client where they've actually had a senior board member go with the newbie to the director's college and then say, this is applicable to us, pay attention to this, and really help show them what's relevant to their
That's an
particular
excellent idea.
That is an excellent idea.
Also creates
That buddy system, yeah.
bond.
That's great. And I'll throw out kind of a strategic pointer. I was recently onboarded on the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, and it's one of those situations where I always talk about this, but you realize in the moment there are questions you're a little nervous about asking because there's such strong expectation that everyone assumes you know the answer, right? So if you teach finance and banking, heaven forbid you get appointed to a bank board. And so I thought it was very interesting, the initial onboarding briefing for new directors, they did one-on-ones with the entire management team for a half day and walked through critical topics. And then at a certain point, someone pulled aside and said, here's the 100 questions that you're either don't know enough to ask or afraid to ask. It doesn't matter either way, right? And this was like a really great way to kind of break through that. And the one-on-one without the other directors there makes a big difference. And I think this is, yeah, I think it's a best practice anyway and a standard practice, but particularly for people who come onto a board who are different from the other board members, no matter how confident you are, there's this odd social performance anxiety, which is just a real thing. So all the things you said.
The other thing just to bring up was you said about when you bring on somebody that's different from all the other board members. The other best practice, I think, and Lee, I don't know if you run across this, is really to not have just one of these kind of people in the room, right? So again, a room of all men and then one female. She's probably not going to be able to do as well unless there's another one. And it's probably the same thing that goes to all sorts of elements of diversity. Yeah. So
we had a board candidate woman who interviewed with the board. 8 men, his average age was 78. Yeah. And she was 50.
Well,
rough road.
Tony Remby Rock, co-giver and co-founder of the Rock Center, all of her boards, she was the first woman. Every single, several Fortune 500s. Yep. And she tells a remarkable story about how, she felt it worked well and it did well, but things were just much, much easier at a practical level once there were more people. Yeah, so I think that's a really, really good point. Well, let's pause here and then switch to questions from the audience. Two points. One, practical, you need to go to the microphone and speak in the microphone if you don't mind. Secondly, ask Lee the questions now because she has to catch a plane, and as the clock strikes 7, she's literally going to jump up and run away. So it's nothing you did or that we did. Maybe, yeah. So you won't get a chance to ask her questions afterwards. I know sometimes people reserve these questions. Yes?
Some people suggest for a person without board experience who's working in industry that they be asked to serve on nonprofit boards. Do you feel that's a viable way of getting the people oriented?
So nonprofit boards, useful, not useful, effective as a way of preparing for public boards. Separate from the question, though, I'd like you to address it. Does it actually help you get onto a public board? These are two kind of separate questions. How about Lee first, and then we'll.
Yeah, I would say in terms of it can't hurt you, but I don't think it is a propellant to get on a public board. I think the value of it first of all, obviously, if you're passionate about what the nonprofit does, I mean that's a given. But in terms of the other people on the board, occasionally you can make connections on the board which will help you. But from our perspective, looking at people on not-for-profit, it's a minor plus, but it's not it's I wouldn't call it a significant factor.
It's the networking, right? I mean, that's really the draw, is if you can network through that experience to find a board member that's on public boards that could then recommend you or something. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And a little side technical note about compensation. If you serve on the nonprofit board and you make compensation decisions, you are, as it happens, much more exposed to personal liability for overcompensating your executive director than you are on a public board.
I am going through that right now.
Yeah, so
exactly.
Just a FYI, pay close attention to your comp decisions always, but if you're on a nonprofit board, extra close. So additional questions along those lines? We've got a bunch more if you don't have any. Don't be shy. Well, then let's turn to our. I skipped a whole bunch. Okay, right. I knew so. You were just waiting. Go ahead.
This sounds very promising and also very daunting at the same time. And some of the statistics that were quoted, like 90% use their own networks for a board search, and fit and chemistry was mentioned over and over and over again. And especially as it is applied to looking for more diverse candidates and casting a wider net. How do you counsel the 78-year-old guy and his 70-year-old board members to be mindful and actually go beyond to embrace that?
It's, I assume the 78-year-old is very smart and loves the company and wants to put the best interest of the company forward. That being said, he will have to look for succession planning for his board. He wants younger people. Because you're asking a director to commit to at least 5 to 10 years of service. So if you do the math, you have to start at least in the 50s or very early 60s to give you that. So I think logic will get him there. But then the next step is, how do you find the people he is comfortable with? And that, in my opinion, comes to a functional area or a functional need or a fit. That would be my thinking on your question.
I would say, I'm sorry, Paul.
No, let's have Lee and then Paula. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I would say I am getting more encouraged than I was. Because, you mentioned, I mean, you can only be, as a sitting CEO, you can only be on one outside board. So that wipes out a lot of different people from consideration. So I think there are more people who are taking this seriously, saying we need to diversify our boards, and we just need to look at a broader pool, and they're related. So when I look back at our placements over the past year or so, I think we've never had a higher percentage of first-time boards, people who haven't been on public boards before. That percentage is going up. So I'm feeling more optimistic.
And I think, it's really, we don't necessarily have to convince the 78-year-old man, because his shareholders will. I mean, the institutional investors are very, very focused on this topic, which is a fantastic thing. And if it's not the institutional investors, the activist investors are. So they're going to get a lot of pressure from a lot of different angles. And that was one of the things I quoted in the very beginning, that it was because of investor influence and pressure, or anticipated investor pressure, that people are making changes. So I think you've got that on our side as well. So I do think there will be a fair amount of change.
And ISS is playing a role in this as they evaluate boards and companies by the way they score them, and they reflect on their board diversity.
And in all those things, it is, I think, strategically advantageous to get ahead of the issue and ahead of the pressure on the board's own terms. Again, because one of the weaknesses with ISS, obviously, and sometimes even with sophisticated institutional investors, is that they don't have time to craft for every company's unique needs and idiosyncrasies. And hence, if they arrive without you getting ahead of it, they are bringing a one-size-fits-all strategy. That is true. And so if you can get ahead of it, sometimes you are in a much more defensible position to say, I know you score it that way, but we've been doing this for a while, and our version is this.
Here's
and
our plan.
It's great.
Here's our
and
plan.
You have a much better chance to see it. So I think there's, again, back to that 78-year-old loves the company, we hope. And so logic hopefully dictates in the end. Kim.
So Lee, I'm going to ask you, because I get this question, and you have the data, I think. A lot of people first time want to be directors. They're going to ask, how much time does it take from when I seriously say I'm ready, I'm qualified, to actually landing on a board seat? If you can give us some of the range, whether for men or women, if it's any different. Thanks.
It's a very good question, but it's also a hard one to answer with a lot of detail. So I'd say once somebody gets on our radar screen as somebody who really we think is ready to be on a board. I mean, what typically happens is if one of us meets somebody we think is fantastic, we share the idea with a group of our colleagues. And I would say, it's going to depend on what that person's background is and when that right opportunity might come. So from when they get on our radar screen until they get their first call with a real opportunity, call it 3 or 4 months. And then beyond that, you never know. I mean, because a search, you said, Dan, it can take as long as a year. I would say on average 6 to 9 months. So, somebody should count on at least a year, And some people can get very lucky. I mean, if you're a retiring female CEO who's not on a board, boom, I would say 2 weeks. So it depends.
It's also worth noting the universe of publicly traded companies is actually shrinking and has been for some time. And so as a practical matter, the universe of available board seats is declining, which is its own issue. Question here and then there.
Thanks. This is very fascinating and excellent, helpful ideas. I'm Scott McLeod, developing World University and School, like Wikipedia on the one hand with MIT OpenCourseWare in its 7 languages. We have a board on the nonprofit side, but having been vetted by a Berkeley Law class, we'd like to create a parallel not-for-profit wing. I mentioned this to Amal and Lee in the beginning, that Silicon Valley Directors Exchange, first talk I ever went to, average board and the Silicon Valley 150 earns something like $298,000 a year. Chair of the board earns something like $450,000 a year. Those are big companies. Can you perhaps, Paula, with your data, start back from the very beginning? How to create a startup board from, you've all talked about very experienced boards and board succession. Where do you go from ground zero? How do you,
That is a challenging question. I mean, I would think, and I don't know that I have a great answer. I'll try. I would say if I was going to start from ground zero, I would start a little bit with your network, with individuals that you know well enough, because you're going to have to convince them to be on your board. So they have to kind of know what you're doing and be able to buy into it, but are, aspirational individuals. So not your next door neighbor necessarily, but somebody who's aspirational, but somebody who you can sell and convince to do it. Because, as we talked earlier, it's a marriage, so it's a two-way street. So you're going to have to get people that want to be on this board as well as people that, you want to have on the board. So I would start with landing one or two, hopefully, again, somewhat aspirational people, and hope that they can then bring in some more, and that's how you kind of build it up. I don't think you're going to have to pay them $298,000 to start.
And a specific recommendation for reading, if you're interested in that stage of startup, is Brad Feld's Startup Boards. A great book, kind of gives a lot of guidelines, in combination with one of the chapters from Eric Ries's Lean Startup. So those two together, I think, give a lot of insight into how to kind of jumpstart the right type of board. So,
what was the first reference again, please?
Brad Feld, the Startup Board. Question?
Slightly different topic, but disclosure requirements. So I think when we started, you discussed Saber-Oxley and then Say on Pay. And then we've talked about the network, best practices, teaching directors how to interview. It's clearly that there's not a protocol or standardized practice for how we select people that go on boards or not. But I'm curious, do we ever get to a point where there are disclosure requirements that force boards to have a more standard protocol to go about this? Because everything else seems to have been regulated, and this still feels like a bit of a black box. And I sit on a number of boards, and I've seen it better and worse. And I'm thinking, why isn't it more regulated? And I understand ISS and Glass-Lewis, but it's all about the end score, right? Are you diverse or not? That's what you get a score on. I am more curious around process, because around comp, I mean, you have to disclose everything. I mean, the level of disclosure around tables and whatnot that are required now is ridiculous compared to how this black box operates, who finally lands the seat or not. So.
Well, I mean, one thing, I'll just throw in a couple of comments, but one thing, so I've been recently even this morning, with several institutional investors, and every of the 10 that I've talked to, and all the way from the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, all the way down to CalSTRS and others, the number one thing that these institutional investors are focused on right now for 2017, the number one issue is board composition. And it goes down to board composition, succession planning, and so forth. So they are going to be looking for more transparent disclosure about what boards are doing. Not necessarily how they're finding people probably, but more, why does the composition of your board suit the company, and why is it fit for the future and really going to take the company to the next level? And it's not an easy thing to describe. I think it's definitely more of an art than a science to be able to get that messaging across, but it's going to become more and more important to be able to do that. And then on the disclosure side, I mean, there was some stuff that Mary Jo White was trying to do with the SEC, trying to get some mandatory disclosure around at least diversity of boards, because right now you don't have to disclose if you have a diverse member or not, and the definition of diversity and all that stuff. But I don't know, we'll have to see with Jay Clayton, with the changes now, where that goes and so forth.
Some of the skills are just self-reported.
Yeah, the skills matrix that people report in. I mean, that's an interesting question. So a lot of people are doing like a skills matrix where you list international skills or operational skills or whatever your financial, whatever the focus is. The issues with some of those that I hear about is that, you go around the boardroom and try to figure out what everybody's skills are, and then you get one board member that says, well, hang on a second, how come Harry has like 6 boxes checked and I only have 3? And then all of a sudden, everybody has 6 boxes, and so then you send that out, and now it looks like, yeah. So the institutional investors are a bit onto that program, and so they're kind of questioning whether or not they like that skills matrix thing or not as well. So
We're out of time.
that's the area.
You can go on without me.
Well, I think we're going to take one last question, but we're going to let Lee get up. Let's give Lee a round of applause and thank her for being here. Thank you so much.
For having me.
So we will, just as a courtesy, I'll let the last question, let me throw out one item too, which is, I think what we're saying is that this kind of current phase of additional scrutiny to board composition may bring with it more clarity around best practices and maybe the emergence of clearer demands from institutional investors, others. So I think it's definitely going to be an interesting time.
Maybe
in the next
not
year or two.
regulation, given the administration. We'll have to see. But
maybe some more insight. Last question. And
my name is Tim, and thank you, by the way, for coming and sharing your insights. So I've had experience in both. So in my 30s, I was a senior level at about 3 different financial services companies. They're top, so Fortune 50. So I got to go to the board meetings and present, right? Strategy, M&A, and so on. I've seen that board of those large companies. They're in their 60s and 70s, right? And it's a very buttoned-down board. There's no arguments. Everything is done behind the scenes. And I've seen that very, and I've heard, being with the CEO explaining this is what we had, we talked about in the bathroom, right? So I've seen that structure. Now I'm on a lot of private boards as an investor. I'm on a lot of private boards, and you're talking about operational issues, talking about the CEO's wife. I mean, you're talking about all of these, literally talking about how you manage Salesforce, right? What would, looking at those two opposite ends, how would they look at someone like me? Because I get this question a lot from a lot of my friends too, who are in that sort of, I'm a CFO at a $30 million startup, right? How would they look at someone like me who's basically, they would not understand. So for example, if I didn't have that experience in financial services to understand how that went, this is a totally different boardroom than a Fortune 50 boardroom where everything is done behind the scenes, everything is very cordial, and here it's knockout, drag-out fights between friends, right? How would they view that as a positive, and it depends on the board clearly, but just from your experience, how would they view people that came from that sort of startup board, right, or Series A board?
This is a great final question because I think Tim is in part saying, you cast this wide net. You might have caught him, and he shows up, and he's a little different. Yeah. How big of a deal is that? What are they going to say?
Marriage or not, or is this a divorce
this is a good final question. So yeah, give us your thoughts.
It would not be fair to you to be on the board of J.P. Morgan.
Of course.
Right?
I've been to the board meeting, though.
Yeah.
It just, each skill will qualify for different kinds of boards. But there are 200 to 500 to maybe $1 billion public companies who need somebody with your skills. And that's why search firms do a great job. They try to map so that it's not that you're not a good board candidate. You are for the right companies. You're not for Ford. You're not for Boeing. Neither am I. So they map the skill to the size of the company, to the stage and what they're looking for. So I think certain companies would love having you as the chair of audit and be on the board. Other companies, you wouldn't want to be there, and neither would they.
Holly, you get the final word.
No, again, it gets back to it's a marriage, right? So both sides have to be able to want to participate, and I think I agree with you. I don't think you would be happy, and they wouldn't be happy.
Right fit.
Yep.
Thank you.
Well, help me thank Amal and Paula. Thank you so much for helping us.